Hello and welcome to Vertmode. The following lecture is from my Udemy course, Complete 3D Animation Masterclass, Create Animated Shorts. If you would like to follow along with the lecture, you can go ahead and download the rig from our website at vertmode.com. I have the link down in the description down there. And if you like my teaching style and you'd be interested in learning how to create this rig along with a lot of other really cool projects, check out our course on Udemy, Complete 3D Animation Masterclass. Okay, so now that we finished our rig, we're ready to test our animation, and we're going to do that by creating something called a walk cycle. Now, a walk cycle is a series of keyframes that we can utilize to make a character walk. An excellent resource to learn more about walks is Richard Williams' The Animator Survival Kit. This is the Animator's Bible, and they have an amazing section about walks. Here is a snipping you can find online. If you just go over to Google and you type in walk cycle reference, you can find various pages from the Animation Survival Kit, because it's so well known, that go over the main poses we're going to be addressing here. So that's going to be the contact pose, the down pose, the passing pose, the up pose, and the contact. I'm going to take you through the process of creating a walk cycle, but I do encourage you, if you do plan to go down this route to become an animator or to work in the field of animation, be it film, game, televisions, whatever, definitely grab this book. It is an amazing book. It's given out in pretty much every college program, and it is definitely one worth buying. All right. So what we're going to start with is just referencing in our scene and getting things set up. And then we're going to go through creating the contact pose, then the down pose, the passing, the up pose, and then finishing things off. So let's get started. First off, if you haven't already, save. And we're going to do our first test by creating a new scene. Coming to File, we're going to go ahead and create a reference here. And we're going to reference in our character rig final, make sure merge into selected namespaces is on, and click reference. And if everything references in good and you hit 6 and you have your textures, then your first step is already complete. There's no issues with your rig. So let's go ahead and do a save scene as, and we're going to come into here now, and we're going to create a new folder here called animations. And we'll just create one in here called test animations. And we'll create a subfolder here, which we are going to name walk cycle. And then inside of here, we'll just go ahead and make this our egg character walk cycle 01 and save. So now that we have that in place, let's go ahead and just create a quick ground plane by creating a polygon primitives plane. I'll scale this up to be nice and big, and we might want to assign a new material to this. I'll go ahead and give it a Lambert, and we'll just go ahead and make this black color or dark gray. That way it looks like asphalt or some sort of a street. And that should be good. From there, I'll just give it a layer. We'll just go ahead and make this GP for ground plane. Save, and then set that to a reference so we can't grab it, and then save again. And we're ready to get into animating. So let's go ahead and dive in and get started with that next. But to kick things off, go ahead and set up your test file where you reference in your rig into a new scene. Make sure it's a new scene because we are going to reuse this rig. You don't want to animate over your rig. And go ahead and grab a ground plane to put underneath it. And also feel free to search for some references of walk cycles. Like I mentioned, if you go online and you Google walk cycle reference, you can find it. I highly suggest looking up Animator Survival Kit. And if you see various images that look like the one I showed you at the start of this, then you'll know that that is the material from that. Not all walk cycle references are good, so just be aware of that. I highly encourage you to go to Richard Williams for his take on things. It is an excellent resource. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. The way to start out a walk cycle is by blocking in your contact poses. The contact pose of a walk cycle is the point in which the foot comes into contact with the ground after the push off and lift up. Now, to get us started, we're going to switch to Windows Workspaces, and we're going to swap over to animation here. And if our rig is functioning correctly, the first thing we should be able to do is just highlight all the controls here and hit the S key. So I'm just going to hit S right at the start. To get us into animation mode, I'm going to come down here and click on our auto keyframe because I think we're experienced enough at this point to work with that somewhat confidently. And now we're going to start with the contact. So the contact pose is going to be described by one foot coming in contact with the ground while the other pushes off. So I'm going to move this front foot forward on the right side, and we're going to lift it up. And I'm going to use my foot roll to do this, to get it up on the heel. and just move this forward to give me a sense of that lifting. So that's going to be what I'm going to do with that foot there. Then I'm going to move the back foot back, and I'm going to use the foot roll again, but get this one up onto the ball of the foot a little bit, like so. So that way it has a nice look. Now, the other thing I'm going to do is just angle these feet out slightly so they're not perfectly straight on. This is a nice feature you can do for feet. And I'm also going to take my pole vectors here and just move them out slightly so the feet are bowing away from the egg to give it a bit of a gated walk here. So it looks like it has legs that aren't perfectly robotic. Now, another thing we can do is we can move the midsection in a bit. We can't move it in too much because of how the egg shape is going. I'll move the back one in as well. We can also think about what we might want the tail to be doing in this. This is kind of a hard one. I think what we're going to do is have the tail move side to side. I'd have to look up tail references to think of the best way to do this, but I'm going to have it swish in the opposite direction of the leg. So if that leg's going forward, that's going to be pushing away from it, is my thoughts. Now, we may also need to come in here and adjust the root control to have a straight knee here. So we want this to be straight, like so, and that's going to be our first contact. So I'm going to highlight this. I'm going to hit S to keyframe this, and then we're going to get to our second contact. Now, when you do enough walks, you'll get used to this, but you can think of the spacing. I like to do my initial walks on 4s. That just means that between every keyframe, there's 4. So if you know the types of frames there are, the next frame would be the down frame, which would be at 4. And then after that would be the passing frame at 8. And then after that would be the up frame at 12. And then we get to our second contact, which is going to be around 16. Now, by blocking in the contacts first, we get a really good look at how the walk is going to look and feel. So that's the reason we go this route. The other thing is we can share information. So for example, if I hit the S key at 16 here, then I have everything keyed in terms of certain controls like the root control. That should be good to go. I can also come here to 32 now because I know 32 is going to be my last frame, and I can hit the S key to get that to be the final contact, and then just narrow this down to 32, and we'll have our start frames for this. Now, we need to come back to 16, and we need to adjust this to be the inverse position of our first frame. So what that means is this foot here is actually going to be going backwards, and I can switch my movement space here to world for this. We're going to have that one backwards, and rather than the foot roll being up, it's going to be the one that's bent, like the other one. And I can get this to be in approximately the same position. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then I can move this one forward, and the foot roll is going to be going in the opposite direction. So that is moving forward. And remember, we had that leg straight, so I'm just going to try and get that to be straight, like so. And then the tail is going to swish in the opposite direction. Since I decided to make it swish, we can swish that there into the opposite direction. And now we should have a little walk that starts to look like a walk. I may need to make some adjustments here, though. I don't quite like how far in that leg's coming, so I'm going to move that a bit, and I might move that one back a little bit. Okay. So if we go ahead and hit play now, you'll see that we get the base movements of a walk. And bare minimum, we could consider this a walk. It's not the most beautiful walk in the world, but this could work. I'm not 100% sure I like how far back the feet are going. I feel like I could push this back even further, and I think I will, to be something more like this. I'll just hit the S key there, and jumping to the next one, I'll do the same thing here, just pushing this back. And since I changed the first frames, I'm going to want to highlight everything here, come to the first frame here and just copy these. So Control C, and then come to the tail end frame here and Control V, because I need that first frame to be the same as the last frame. And that's going to be what creates something called a cycle. So just copy and paste that, and that's going to give us our base keyframes for our walk. We can also think what might happen here to the egg. The egg might tilt a little bit in this direction as that leg's coming forward. So I might want to change that, or it might be going this direction with the leg coming forward. I actually think that might be the case looking at how the legs are working. So I'm just going to tilt that a little bit, and then I'm going to come to this one here and tilt that a little bit. So we get a little bit of a wibble wobble there. And then I'm just going to copy and paste this from the first frame to the last frame. So Control C and Control V. Okay, so now we should have a lot more character to this little character, and you can see how that's looking. Now notice it's glitching out a little bit at the end there. That means my cycle isn't perfect. So what that means is I need to come in here and I need to make sure I copy and pasted all of these from frame 1 to frame 32. So for some reason, the egg tilt doesn't want to copy correctly. Let me try copying that again, Control C, and then just come to the tail end here and Control V. Okay. So that looks like it is copying okay. Okay, so that is going to be our first key pose for this, which is going to be the contact pose. What we're going to do next is we're going to move into something called the passing pose, and from there we should have something that looks a bit more like a walk. You may want to turn textures off for this. It might be a little bit easier to see since our textures are pretty dark with that standard surface shader, or if you wanted to, you could add in some lighting. So as a challenge, what I want you to do is go ahead and set up that first contact to contact pose. You're going to have 3 poses, the first contact, then the second contact is going to be the foot going the opposite way, and then finally you're going to copy the first contact over. Then, if you haven't done so already, do a save as and just save out another iteration. So that way, if you have any mistakes, you can come back and edit them. All right, so the next pose I like to do is going to be the passing pose. And that's because the passing pose is one of the key characteristic poses of the walk. It's when one leg passes the other. This happens about 8 frames into the cycle. The 4th pose is the down pose, and then the 8th is the passing. Now, coming into the passing, I'm just going to get to frame 8. I'm going to highlight all of this and hit S. A lot of this is actually going to stay pretty much the same. The egg tilt can stay the same and the tail can stay the same. We're mainly going to worry about the elevation of the egg, and we're going to worry about the placement of the feet. Now, when we walk, this foot in front is going to slide backwards here, and it's going to be flat on the ground. So at this stage, we want to make sure our foot roll is at 0, so it's perfectly flat. And we want to make sure it's about at the midsection of the character. So we're pretty much there, maybe a little bit further back. And then we're going to start to push off our leg a bit, and this should straighten out a bit here. And you can see we can actually see we get a little bit of a skinning issue there, but right around here should be good in that elevation. So we're going to slide and push. Now, this other leg is going to be lifting off the ground. So rather than being sliding like this, we're actually going to pull it up so the knee's bent, and we're going to rotate it so the foot is coming forward like so. And notice I'm using the rotation here. I'm going to want to set the foot roll to 0 in this instance, so that way I can get this set up correctly. This is a pretty dramatic walk, but it is an egg, so we kind of let it do its thing. It might also kick outward a little bit to make room for lifting its foot because it has such a big floppy foot, but that could be a good pose there. And we should see sort of a 4 shape from the side here. Now, because this is lifting, I might also consider bringing the tail down this way a bit to kind of give that sense of inertia of this pushing off the ground. And with that in place, that can work as our passing pose. And what you'll see now is it looks like the character is taking a step from this frame to this frame. So that is a good sign that we have successfully gotten this to look right. So what we need to do now is do that, but for the other side. So we can come to here. It's not going to be frame 20. It's going to be frame 24. We can hit the S key on all of these to keyframe them again. And we can look for which foot needs to lift. So if you look at this first one, the foot going backwards is the one that slides on the ground, and the one going forward is the one that lifts. So on this one, we're going to want to look for whichever one's going backwards, and that's going to be the one that's going to be on the ground. So that's going to be this far foot here. So we can pull this over, and we can go ahead and place that to be flat on the ground. So we can set the foot roll to 0, move it back just a little bit so that it is aligned with the egg better, and we can get that placement. Now, another thing we might want to do is come in here to the root control that we lifted this with, copy its keyframe here in terms of height, and then come to this one and paste that. So it'll be in the same height position. So that way we have an idea of where that needs to go. Now, looking at this first frame, we can see we have a little bit of that bending to the knee, but this one, it's pretty aggressive. So maybe I need to bring this forward a little bit, or maybe in a little bit. That might take some experimentation. Or maybe even bring this down just a little bit until we get something not quite as aggressive there in terms of that. Let me just check this. Actually, no, I think that should be fine. There might be something I'm missing here. It is lifting a little bit there, so I think maybe moving that forward a bit will be a good start. Okay, so that should be okay. I'm not too worried about those bends. They look fairly natural, and it should happen kind of quickly, so we'll go with that for now. Now, as far as the other foot goes, we're going to get this into position to be the 4 shape. So let's go ahead and zero this out. Let's pull this up and rotate this down and maybe pull it out a bit. I want to look at how wide I made this one. So I made it pretty wide. So we'll do the same thing here. And we can just play around with this setup. And let me make sure it's the opposite foot. It is. And just get that to look good. And I'll turn off the texture so I can see that better. And that should give me that stepping there. The other thing I did was I made the tail come down a little bit. So we'll do the same here. So that way it is going down, and then we can hit S. And now at this point, our character should pretty much look like they're walking. So if you can get contact to contact to contact, and then introduce the passing pose, you're pretty much there. There's not much else you need to do to make that happen. One change I might want to make though, as I'm going, is with the tail. In the contact pose, rather than having the tail be straight like it is, I might go ahead and just rotate it up slightly to be the counterpart to the down here. So that way we get that upward angle and it's not perfectly flat. And I'll just have to copy and paste the first frame here to the last. And I don't know if that's actually working, which is kind of unfortunate. Copy, Control-C, and Control-V. Okay. So that should be working now. And there we go. We're getting our cute little walk here for our character to give it a little bit more character. This leg, though, I'm finding interesting how it's deforming. I don't quite like the way that's looking in this pose, which makes me wonder if the skinning's off or if I just need to move that down slightly. Because it looks okay on the opposite side. Okay, so that's looking pretty decent. So that's going to be our passing pose. So once again, the passing pose, when we come in here, there's a few characteristics to be aware of. One is that the root control is going to go up. The passing leg, the one going backwards, is going to go flat on the ground. And then the opposite leg is going to come and make a 4 shape with this front leg. So those are some of the main features that we see when we are creating the passing pose. So let's go ahead and save this. And then as a challenge, what I want you to do is go ahead and get in your passing pose. Okay, so we're ready to get in the next pose here. And let's go ahead and do the down pose. The down pose is what happens right after the contact. And the idea behind the down pose is that this foot is going to slap against the ground. So we can set our foot roll to 0. And the root control is actually going to come down as far as it can. And this is where we could also make the tail kick up a little bit more, just to give us something kind of cute like that. And then this back foot is going to continue going back. And as a matter of fact, what I would say here is the foot roll at this point should probably be -5. Translate Y, actually should be different in that pose. But what I would say is let's get rid of the foot roll, actually, on that back foot, and move into a rotation-based movement so that it looks like it's pushing off the ground. Now, these toes are a challenge. I'm not going to lie. We have to kind of decide here. We could try and get it to have a bit of a kick. This might not look that great. You can see that foot kind of going through the ground there, and not exactly what we're going for. We also might want to make this come down even more, which is kind of wild, but we really want to get that feel of a squat down in the down pose. And we're sort of getting it now. This character's just already really close to the ground, I think, is a challenge. And that should make that feel like it's kicking off there. So this is an instance where we might need some in-betweens, or I could come in here and just use the toes to really kind of push the toes in that pose so it feels like they slide off the ground and come straight forward. And I think that might be the direction I opt to go in here. So that way we get that effect and we get an okay look to things. So that is pretty much all we need to do for that pose to work. So if we go ahead and hit play now, you'll see this pose dips a bit more and has a little bit more spring to it than that second one. So let's get that second one set up. Let's go to frame 20 here, and we'll go ahead and find the same situation. Find the one that's going to slap on the ground and make sure that's slapping. So that's going to be this one here. Make sure we get that foot roll to 0 so it's there quicker. Let's go ahead and pull this down so we get more of that squatty pose. We're going to pull this back, we decided, get rid of the foot roll, utilize rotations instead, and come in with our toes here and just bend those in. And then with the tail, we're just going to grab all those tail controls and just give them a slight tilt up. And that will get our second down pose. And it looks like I actually need to push this down even more. So we get a good squat there. And that's going to give us a nice little bounce to our walk now. So that should add a little bit more character to the walk. And we got a nice little tumble from the front, and we got a nice little waggy tail, which looks fun and childlike. So I think we can call that good for the down pose. So just kind of reviewing the characteristics of the down pose, the most significant aspect of the down pose is that the character comes down. The root control comes down. Another really key characteristic is that we have the slap on the ground here. This foot is going to be flat and planted. And then our back foot is going to retreat backwards and get ready for the lift. So you have to think of where it's going. It's an anticipation pose. And then in terms of follow through and overlap, anything that dangles like a tail is going to go in the opposite direction of the body. So if the body's going down, the tail is going to curve up a bit. Okay, so save if you have followed along. And as a challenge, what I want you to do is go ahead and add in your down pose if you have not done so already. All right, so go ahead and give that a shot, and then we'll get in here and add the final pose, which is going to be our up pose. Okay, so we're ready for our final pose, which is the up pose. We're going to come in here to our frame 12, and we're going to add in our up pose. Now, the up pose is a bit of a continuation of the passing pose. What's going to happen here mainly is our root control is going to go up. Now, this foot control here, what we can do is make sure that the foot roll is all the way at -5 to give us more room here. And we can then push this up to be at more of an extreme. Now, that actually isn't the prettiest looking setup, I would say. I might actually take this and play around with this and see what looks good. Maybe around here at like -3 or -4, a little bit less intense, and get the egg in the air as high as we can go before that leg starts to just look terrible on us. And we don't really want it to lock up. But I'm willing to go something like this. I don't mind these little dimples that we're getting. I feel like they work for like a baby character. Then from there, we can keep this leg going forward, but what can be nice is to kind of drag it a little bit so that the foot is dragging on the ground somewhat. And I think I have my rotations in world. I'm going to switch those to object space, so that way I can rotate along there and just have that set. Now, another thing that we would expect in the up pose is for the tail to kind of be in the most downward position. So we'd expect that to be down a bit in the up pose. And that should pretty much do the trick. Push off and another foot coming down, and there we go. So the one thing I'm noticing, though, is that we've kind of flatlined here, and the up pose should continue going up. So that's going to be something I want to experiment with, is making sure that this gains elevation. And that might be a factor of coming in here to my passing pose and actually toning this down. And since these are both in the same spot, I'm actually going to tone those down a bit. But that way, this has a high point here at the up pose, and then it comes down. And now we should get a nice little bounce to that walk in that first section. So let's get to the final section here, and at 28, add this in. I can copy and paste the same keyframe here over, so I can just Control-C, Control-V, to get the same elevation. I'll just adjust this handle really quick so it's not quite so ugly. And then we can create some of the same adjustments where we have a bit more of this foot roll. We used -4 last time, and we can come in here and rotate this foot forward. So it's dragging a little bit, and we can rotate the tail down. And you can see I'm using a lot of the information from the first keyframes to save me time. And now if we hit play, we have a happy little walk for our egg here, just walking along, having a good old day. And looking pretty cool. Now, there is a bit of a strain here, I feel like. So I might want to make a slight change to this, maybe moving this foot forward a little bit more in this frame, so that way the knee doesn't lock. But that looks pretty good. Okay, so that's going to get us a nice little test walk cycle and get our little egg going. We can turn off the egg controls there, and we can see how that looks. I like it. Okay, so that's going to get in all our key poses, our contact, our down, our passing, our up, and we should have a character that looks like they're walking. Now, you might be asking, hey, that's great. How do we make it move forward? We're going to take a look at that soon, but before we do that, we're going to do a quick cleanup on this and just get a walk that is semi-functional for what we would like to have. We're not going to use this walk for anything, but I want to go through the process so you guys can understand how to create a walk in the case you do want to take this character to the next step. So as a challenge, if you have not done so yet, go ahead and add in that final keyframe, which is going to be the up frame, and we're going to do a bit of refinement on this character. All right, so let's go ahead and get this refinement going, and we're going to go ahead and start out with our feet controls. There's a few cool things we can do when we're doing walk cycles. One is using a motion trail. So if you go ahead and grab your foot control and you go to visualize and create editable motion trail, it will give you a good idea of how this should look. Generally with a walk cycle, what we end up seeing for a motion trail is we see it slide back, we have an arc up here in the back, and then we come forward, and that is essentially what we want to get. So we already have a good look to this. There's a few changes we want to make right off the bat. One is going to be on translate Z. In order to make a walk cycle work correctly, you need to make sure that Z is set to linear. And this is going to be one of the interesting tricks, but this helps prevent foot slide. So we're going to highlight all of these, and we're going to set this to be linear so it's in a straight line. Now from here, we can go ahead and make sure it's linear while on the ground, and that's going to be where it's planted flat. So even though it looks like our character is constantly moving, the foot that's sliding on the ground is actually not going to be moving at all when the character's walking forward. So we want to go ahead and make that as flat as possible, which is going to require us to actually come in here and delete these keyframes. Now, this is going to change the position it's at the various points, and it may actually affect our other poses, so that's worth being aware of. Now, after this, it lifts off the ground, and we actually don't need this to be linear anymore. So we can highlight these last three and send them to auto. And that's going to make them have a smoother arc so that they lift up. Another thing I'm noticing is the character kind of angles out here and then back and then forward. It's an okay look. I may want to find a way to kind of alleviate that. So one way you could do that is highlight this and do a broken tangent. And then we could play around with making this tangent a little bit different here so that it eases into that smooth a little bit better. And we could even consider being brave enough to delete these, which probably isn't the best way to go. So I think I'll leave that be, but we could decide how we want to do that. Now, I think I'm just going to leave it the way it was since this is just a test animation, but that will give our foot the first thing that it needs. From here, we can check things like the translate Y. The translate Y should be flat when the foot is on the ground. And then when it's lifting, it should be sort of a gradual bell shape. So for example, here, I could consider toning this down a bit so we have more of a lift off. Then I could go ahead and arc these to have a little bit of a bell. So that way we get a nice arc into the end here. And then I can just straighten that out. So that will give us a nice lift. When it comes to translate X, when this is on the ground, this should be flat. So between here and here should be the same. So I'm actually going to copy this and paste this here. That didn't work. Control C, Control V. Delete the area in the middle, and that should be fine. And the reason why is when it's flat on the ground, you just don't want motion. From here, it's going to swing out, and that's perfect. So that takes care of the translates. Now the rotates, once again, should all be flat when it's on the ground. So we already have a good look. Here, we kind of have this whoosh out and whoosh in. What I might consider doing is just deleting those other two keyframes. But you can see that actually we're there to correct the toenails from going into the ground, it seems. So I could also play around with this and just try and make it have more of an arc. What I would say here is maybe on this one, play around with this rotation. This rotation is not exactly one-to-one now that I'm looking at it, because we're also counter animating our other effects for our foot, which is the base controls. So sometimes you do have to eyeball it because the graph's not going to give you everything you're looking for. So just kind of be aware of that. What I might do here is play around with this as different shape rather than have it angled down, have it angled up because of the claws. And I think I like that better. It gives us a smoother look. Rotate Y, same deal. You know, this looks okay, so I'm just going to leave a B, and rotate Z, that looks okay. So I'm going to call that good for that foot's refinement, just to keep things nice and simple. We don't need to go crazy with it. Now I can go ahead and leave that motion trail there for now and just come to the next one here and go to visualize and create editable motion trail. And you'll see it looks similar, which is a good sign. Now, first thing is for the translate Z, we want to look at that area it contacts the ground, which is here. Highlight to its end slide point, which is going to be the end, and set that to linear and just delete everything in between those. That way we have the nice slide. And then as far as this goes back here, we could play around with just making this look a little bit smoother. I actually kind of liked what we had manually, so I'll leave that be, but maybe try and smooth out the curve a little bit so it doesn't go backwards as much. And maybe pull it down just a little bit to make sure it's continuously moving in the right direction. Okay. Translate Ys we can check, so just make sure when it's on the ground, those are in contact. And then here you can see that we are kind of losing it, so I'm just going to give that a little bit of an angle. That way we don't have a flat point there and it's constantly raising as it goes. Translate X, this is the sideways one. So remember, as soon as it comes in contact with the ground, this should be flat. So I'm going to delete this one here and actually copy and paste this, because remember the start frame and end frame have to be the same. So I'm just going to Control C there, Control V there. So we'll just have a slight move out and then it will come back into alignment. Rotates, we have the same situation going here where we have this sort of weirdness going. I think just switching these out so this lifts is a good way to go. And then just make sure it's flat while on the ground. The Ys here look a little bit funky, but I can deal with that. And then the rotate Zs, we can just kind of hammer out here to be a bit smoother. Okay, so that's going to give us some quick feet refinement. Nothing too exciting for this one, but that's good enough. Now, we don't really need to refine the knees on this one. We can delete these motion trails. Moving up to something like the root control, the root control is mainly going to be translate Y, and you want to see that bouncing ball sine wave. So you're going down and up, down and up. This looks good. All we need to do is just kind of tidy this up to be a little bit smoother. And I can do that without really looking at the keyframe or the animation. We have what we need here. It's just a matter of making that feel a little bit better. When it comes to the tilt of the egg, we should just have a sine wave like this. And to smooth it out, you can actually delete away everything except for the contact poses. And this is a nice trick I like to use on hips to just give them a good sway. The tail is a little bit more complicated because we have a lot of rotations going on here. What I would say is a good idea is to identify the extremes and delete everything that is not an extreme. So in this particular case, it's going to be the contact poses and the up pose. So we're going to want to come into the passing pose and just delete this, and then do the same over here. This is the contact, this is the down, this is the passing, and just delete that. And that should give us smoother curves. We can then come in here to each of these and refine them further if we want to take that to the next level, but that should give us a smooth end result. All right, so that's going to be our initial refinement pass. So I'm going to save this really quick, and we're going to talk about turning on cycle visibility and cycles in general. So the reason this is cycling is because when I hit play, it restarts. But if I were to set this to say 64, twice the length of time, and hit play, you'll notice after 32, the character freezes. Now, we can actually turn on cycling by highlighting all our controls here. And down in the graph editor, we can use either these icons here, or we could use the curves menu to make these cycle. If you come into curves, you can see that you have pre-infinity, post-infinity, and you can do things like cycle or cycle with offset. Now, let's go through this menu because I think this is a good place to begin to know where it's located. So you're going to highlight all your controls, go to curves, post and infinity, cycle, and then you can come in here to curves, pre-infinity, cycle. And what that's going to do is it's going to make it so when you hit play, that these are going to cycle infinitely. Now, what's a downside to going through the menu? Notice the visuals didn't change. The visuals for these exist down here. And we have two different visuals. We have the one that is side by side. It looks like a little dot and comes up and has a dot, 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 and has another line here. That's going to be the cycle pre-infinity and then the cycle post-infinity. If we go ahead and click those on, this one here and this one here, we should see that we get our visual curve and we can see this cycling forever. Now, what's interesting is you'll notice that at the end there, the character kind of jitters a little bit. And if I go and extend this out beyond 64 to something like 200, we might notice that pattern every now and then. Looks like it's not happening too much, but sometimes that's caused by our frames not being perfectly aligned from one to another. So let's take this root control here and let's go do something like the translate Y, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So if you take a look at this area here, you can see how the animation tangent should slide in here. So when you're doing a walk cycle, you need to make sure you grab your front tangent and adjust it, and then come to your back tangent and adjust it to match. And now that's going to get rid of that jitter. We can check something like the translate Z, the rotates. Okay, all those are good on the body. We can then do the same for the hip. The hip looks fine. Come down here to foot 1. We can check the translate X. Those all look good. Translate Y, translate Z. Those all look fine. Rotations, all these look fine. You can assume if it's good on one foot, it's probably good on the other, but only do that if you're in a hurry. It doesn't take long to check. Now, this one could be changed here on the translate Z. That could be tilted in a little bit better. So you can see there's a good example of where your assumption is going to cost you quality. And then we can come into the tails, and hopefully the tails are fine. They could be a little bit better. And yeah, definitely somewhere like here. And I could actually just consider deleting that frame. Actually, I should delete that frame. I don't know why this frame is here. Or actually, is that the down pose? I think that is actually the down pose. But I could consider deleting the down poses here and just have the contact and the up poses, which would likely be fine. So that's our contact, that's our down. So contact and up poses. I actually lose a bit of character doing that, so I think we'll not do that. So those should be okay, but if we go through each of these individually, we can see that we may want some tweaks there. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave it be just to kind of get through this, but there you go. That's going to be the basics of turning on that cycling. Now we have the infinite cycling, which is great. So if you want to turn this off, you can come into curves pre-infinity, and we can set that to constant, and curves post-infinity and set that to constant. And if you hit play now, it will go back to the default where those just go flat. So let's do that for now until we get this moving forward, and I'll show you how to do that next, but that's going to be the process there of doing the final touches on a cycle, just kind of refining it based on how it's cycling overall, and also how to toggle the cycling on and off inside of the animation editor in case you do want to make something cycle within a scene. So as a challenge, what I want you to do is finish up your walk cycle to this point, get the refinement done on it, do the walk cycle refinement as well, and then we're going to talk about how to make a walk move forward.